Assalamu alaikum. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent and the most merciful. Guys, today I'm going to explain you about inverse function. Okay, this inverse function, it's a very important function. Sometimes I don't understand what is inverse. Okay, and this inverse involving in a trigonometric functions means inverse trigonometric inverse function, right? So 80% student get confused in inverse function. Okay, so I'm going to explain you about the inverse function, and then we will see about sine inverse function or the cos inverse functions, right? And then we will solve the question of domain involving inverse functions, right? Okay, so this is very important. Please have a look. And if you have a problem, you can just write down in comments, and then when we have a time I will explain you. Okay, so I'm going to explain you about first what is the meaning of inverse, right? And how will you find inverse. So for example, the topic inverse, right? I'm going to start from the scratch, right? So inverse. Okay, what is the meaning of inverse? For example, if you have an equation y is equal to 2x plus 1. Okay, I'm not going to explain this one, but I'm just going to give you a basic idea of this one. The question here, find the inverse. Find the inverse, right? Okay, so what you have to do, you have to means in place of y just plug in x, and in place of x just plug in y. This is the simple concept to find the inverse. Okay, whenever we have an equation and someone is saying that please find the inverse, what you have to do, in place of x just plug in x, in place of y just plug in x, and in place of x just plug in y. Okay, means here this is y, just plug in x, here this is x, just write down y, and then make y as a subject. You can find the inverse. Okay, so here as you can see, find the inverse of this equation, right? So what will I do here? This is y, I'm going to write down here x, and this is what? 2. Here in x I'm going to write down y plus 1, right? Okay, so what now you have to do, the next step, that you have to make y as a subject. So how will you solve this question? This x plus 1 shifted there, so this is what? Minus 1 is equal to 2y. Or if you are going to divide by 2 here, 2 here, so 2 cancel, you can say y is equal to x minus 1 divided by 2. Remember, this y is known as the inverse of this function, and it is represented by f of inverse x. Like this is your fx. Okay, so this is inverse, and now inverse is x minus 1 divided by 2. Okay, this is the way to find out inverse. Okay, and one more thing. For example, here if I say find out some order pairs, right? For example, if I say, just a basic idea, I'm going to write down here x is equal to 1, x is equal to 2, and x is equal to minus 1, for example, right? So what is the order pair of this point here? You just plug in 1 here, so 2 multiplied by 1, 2, 2 plus 1, 3, so this will be 3. And here you can say this is 2, so when you put 2 multiplied by 2 is 4, 4 plus 1, 5. And here if you plug in minus 1, this will be minus 2 plus 1, this will be minus 1, right? So here, if you put minus 1 here, so minus 2 plus 1, this is what? Minus 1, okay? So the question is, we have just 3 order pairs, right? So here you notice that I just plug in here and then find out the values of y, right? Here we will not solve, and I know what will be the order pairs here. 3 order pairs. Okay, not going to approach any values. I'm not going to evaluate anything, right? I want to see, this is 1 and 3, right? So this is x and this is y. Just plug in and just change it. Okay, just switch it. So this is 3, so just 3 write down here 3, and this is what? 1 here. So here this x work as y here, and this y work as x here, right? So this will be what? 5 comma 2, and this is what? Minus 1 comma minus 1. If you want to check it, you can just check here. If you put 3 here, so 3 minus 1, 2 divided by 2, which is 1, right? If you put here 5 minus 1, which is 4, 4 divided by 2, which is 2. So this is the very easy way. If you know the x and y, just switch it. Okay, so in place of x, just write down y. In place of y, just write down x. And by this procedure, you can just find out the inverse of the given functions, right? Okay, you know the method, you know the concept, you know the procedure, how to find the inverse. My next question goes to the inverse that you just find out right now is a function or not. This is very, very, very important. Your inverse is a function or not. Okay, you know how to find the inverse, but this inverse is a function or not. This is a critical question, right? So I'm going to tell you one thing which is very important. Okay, so please, you know the graph of any function, right? You have linear, quadratic, cubic, greatest integer functions, trigonometric functions. You have a lot of functions, right? And if you want to find out the inverse is a function or not, you must know one important concept of one-to-one function. This is very important. So I'm going to explain you here one-to-one function. One-to-one function. This is very, very, very important. Okay, one-to-one function. Once you understand the concept of one-to-one, it is so easy that you can just explain the given function, the given inverse is a function or not. Okay, but without knowing this one, it is hard. You have to calculate, then you have to draw it. It will take time. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what is the meaning of one-to-one function. Function you know very well. How to check function? You have a vertical line. If you just have one intersection point, you can say, yeah, it is a function. But what is the definition of one-to-one function in an easy way? Okay, so for example, you have any graph. Okay, for example, I have a graph here, this one. Okay, this is the graph of y is equal to x square, and I know this is a function. If I ask about function, look, function is a different thing and one-to-one function is a different thing, right? So if I say y equal to x square is a function, yes, it is a function y. If you draw any vertical line test, you have just one intersection point. So you can say, yeah, y equal to x square is a function. But now my question is, y equal to x square is one-to-one or no? This is very important. This is one-to-one or no? So what you have to do, if you want to know it is one-to-one or no, draw a horizontal line. Draw a horizontal line. This is very important, okay? If you want to know that the given function is one-to-one or no, you have to draw a horizontal line. And if you have if you have more than one intersection point, if you have more than one intersection point, if you have more than one intersection point, it is not one-to-one. It is not one-to-one. It is not one-to-one, right? It is not one-to-one. Okay, one-to-one what? One-to-one function. And if it has just one intersection point, just one, draw the horizontal line. And if you have just one intersection point, you will say, yeah, this is one-to-one. Okay, so I'm going to give you some question and tell me the function is one-to-one or no. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to give you, for example, I have this function, a linear one. I have a cubic function, this one. I have absolute function. Okay, and okay, so it's enough, I think, right? Okay, so if I say that, can you please tell me this one? This one is a function. This one is also a function. This one is also a function. Okay. This one is function. This A. This is A. This is B. This is C. These are the function. Why? Because when you just draw a vertical line test, you have just one intersection point. Okay, so it is a function. I know this one. This is linear, this is cubic, and this is what? Absolute function. But my question here, it is one-to-one or no? It is one-to-one or no? So what you have to do, draw the horizontal line. So how many intersection point? Just one. If you have just one intersection point, you can say, yeah, it is one-to-one. Okay, for example here in the second one, how many intersection point? Just one. You can say, yeah, it is one-to-one, one-to-one function. Here, if you see the third one, the C, you have two intersection point. Say no, no, it is not one-to-one. It is not one-to-one function. Okay, so the question here, this is one-to-one, this is one-to-one, but this is not one-to-one. Now listen, the question was, if you know how to find the inverse, right, and after then you want to check that the inverse is a function or not, so please listen carefully. If the inverse is one-to-one, if the inverse is one-to-one, the inverse is a function. Okay, for example, I'm going to give you here example. I'm going to explain you here. For example, I have this graph, right? I have this graph, okay? I have this one. Okay, this is, I know the graph, okay? This is the graph of y is equal to x square. And I know how to find the inverse, okay? So very simple, you can just find out the inverse. In place of y, just write down x. In place of x, just write down y, and then make y as a subject, okay? You know it. You know how to find the inverse. My question is, the inverse of this one. I'm going to write down here. The inverse of this. The inverse of this is a function or not a function? Okay, the inverse of this is a function or not a function? Okay, the inverse of this means this equation, right? Okay, what do you have to draw? Draw a horizontal line. If you have what? Two intersection point, it means this is not one-to-one, right? It's not one-to-one. Not one-to-one. If this is not one-to-one, we'll say the inverse of this is not, the inverse of this function is not a function. It's not a function. Okay? The inverse of this is not a function. See here. The inverse of this is not a function. Look, I didn't solve this question, right? I know the graph of this one, and I checked this is not one-to-one. If this is not one-to-one, the inverse of this is not a function. I can prove it also. Just prove this one. Prove it. Okay? For example, you have y is equal to x square, right? Okay. So, for finding the inverse, what you have to do, in place of y, write down x. In place of x, just write down y square. So now you can say y is equal to what? Under root x, right? Y is equal to under root x. I'm talking about under root x, right? And normally, whenever we draw this one, you will find what the graph of this one, because it has positive and negative both values, right? So this is the graph of y is equal to plus minus under root x. And when you draw a line, vertical line, you will find this is your inverse. This is your inverse, right? And this it has two intersection point, okay? And when we check a vertical line test, we find not a function, okay? So because I know the inverse, this is inverse of this one, right? So inverse is not a function. We check it here already, because this given function is what? not one to one. If this is not one to one, the inverse is not a function. If the given function is not one to one, the inverse is not a function. Okay. And another example, if I say I have another example, for example, if I have y is equal to x, x plus 1, for example, if you have y is equal to x plus 1, right? So this is the graph of y is equal to x plus 1, and my question is, this graph or this equation, we can find the inverse, right? Okay, so the inverse of this one, again I'm going to write down the same things. The inverse of this means the given equation, right? The inverse of this is a function or not a function. Okay, so again, just draw a horizontal line here. How many intersections? Just one intersection. So you can say this is 1 to 1. 1 to 1. So if this is 1 to 1, 100% the inverse of this is a function. A function. So whenever you are going to find the inverse of this one, you will see that would be the function. You can just prove it here again. Okay, for example, this equation was y is equal to x plus 1. So how will you find, for example, if you have your equation was y is equal to x plus 1, this is your question, and now I'm going to find out the inverse. So what will I do? In place of y, I'm going to write down x here, and in place of x, I'm going to write down y here. This is plus 1, so this x minus 1 is equal to y. You can say y is equal to what? X minus 1, and y means what? F of inverse x, which is x minus 1, and then you draw the graph of x minus 1. You will find the graph here, the y-intercept is minus 1. This is minus 1. This is the graph of what? This is not y, you can say inverse function. This is your inverse. Okay, this is your inverse function, which is what? X minus 1. And guys, you know, if you have this one, which is the inverse of this one, if you want to know that this one is a function or no, draw the vertical line. You have how many intersections? Just one. You can say, yeah, it is a function. Yes, it is function. So we can say the inverse of this is a function. Why? Because this is 1 to 1. So in brief, again I'm going to explain to you, if you have an equation and you know the graph well, okay, and you know how to find the inverse, you can find the inverse of any functions, right? Okay, and after then you are going to check that the inverse is a function or not. So if the given equation is 1 to 1, yes, the inverse is a function, but the given equation is not 1 to 1, then the inverse is not a function. This is, please watch my video again, and if you have a problem, you can ask me. Okay, now my question is, what is the main concern of this video today? That I want to tell you one thing. We studied about trigonometric inverse functions. Okay, so I want to discuss something, and please have a look on that. Then I will describe, then I will discuss something here. Okay, wait, give me 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, so I'm talking about a sine theta, okay? This is very important, sir. Please, everyone, please have a look on that. I have sine x, and I already explained the graph of sine x in my previous lecture, okay? And I told you The graph of the sine is this one. Something like that. Okay. And so on. Something like that, right? Okay. So this is sine x, okay, trigonometric function. This is a trigonometric function, and this is a function because when we draw any vertical line test, we have just one intersection point, okay? And that is why we know about it. This is a trigonometric function because all trigonometric is a function. All trigonometrics are functions, right? Okay. Now I'm going to find out the inverse of sine. This is very important, okay? So, so how will you find the inverse of this one? So in place of y, write down x, and this is sine. And in place of x, just write down what? Y. Then sine can be written as what? Sine inverse x, which is what? Y. Or y means you can say y is equal to sine inverse x, and y means what? This is your inverse sine inverse x, right? This is, I got the inverse of sine x, okay? So this is inverse of this one. But guys, I have a very interesting question I want to ask you. This is also called trigonometric inverse function, right? Trigonometric inverse function. Trigonometric inverse function, okay? See, means trigonometric inverse function. I already explained here inverse as a function. It means inverse is a function, yes or no? And you can see this in Google. Trigonometric inverse function. It means it is sure that all the trigonometric function has inverse, and that inverse is a function. But I have a question. Can you see this one? What is the domain of this one? The domain of sine x is minus infinity to positive infinity. Means the domain here of sine is what? Real number, right? From minus infinity to positive infinity. But guys, if you see the nature of sine x, you will find that this is not one-to-one. Why? Because when we draw a horizontal line, I have more than one intersection point. Yes or no? As this one I told you there. So you can see a lot of intersection point. When you draw a horizontal line, you will find more than one intersection point. You can say this it's not one-to-one, right? One-to-one. It is not one-to-one. Again, this is very important point. Not one-to-one means this one is not one-to-one. The sine x is not one-to-one. When this is not one-to-one, so inverse, how inverse can be a function? How inverse can be a function? This is very important. When the sine x is not one-to-one, how the inverse can be a function? And here we write down inverse function. Inverse is not a function. So then why we just write down inverse function? Because in the sine x, the nature of the sine x is not one-to-one. And if this is not one-to-one, we cannot say that this is inverse function. We can find inverse, but we cannot say that inverse is a function. But inverse are function. Everybody knows about it. So what was the reason behind it? Okay. So now we will discuss about, yes, you are right. Means I am right. Why? Because sine x and the inverse of sine x is not one-to-one. So what you have to do, there is a concept here, restricted domain. Restricted domain means we will not consider the domain as a real number, right? If the domain of sine x, if the domain of the sine x is a real number, then inverse is not a function. Remember, if the domain of the sine x is real number, then the inverse never function. Then we cannot say. But if we restricted the domain of sine x, we make some limit on the domain of sine x, then we will say that the trigonometric inverse function. So what are the restricted domain? I am going to explain you here. So whenever we okay. So when we talk about the inverse function, trigonometric inverse function, especially in sine x, then we have to make the domain as a restricted. Okay, so here you can see this one where we have a maximum value is 1 and minimum value is -1. So this is from pi by 2 and this is what, minus pi by 2. So what you will see here, I'm going to erase this part. I'm not considering all these things for finding the trigonometric inverse function. And here also we make the instruction here, right? We make the instruction here and you will see our graph is just now when we discuss about the trigonometric inverse function, we consider the graph of the sine is just this one. For this one exists. Okay, so what is the domain? Because this is now 1 to 1, right? This is now 1 to 1 function. So when this is now 1 to 1 function, why? Because when we draw any horizontal line here, okay, you have just one intersection point, so we can say this is now 1 to 1 function. Then the inverse exists and this is called inverse function, right? So remember one thing, for the sine we always consider the domain from minus pi by 2 to pi by 2 only. So what is the domain in this case? This is called restricted domain. restricted restricted domain, which is minus pi by 2 to pi by 2. So when we consider this one minus pi by 2, so minus pi by 2 to pi by 2, then the range here, so the range here will be what? -1 to 1. Okay, so range does not have any problem. The range has the same, -1 to 1. So now today we have to discuss about a trigonometric inverse function. So when we talk about the inverse function, this is the representation of inverse function, trigonometric inverse function. And guys, I already explained you because this has been developed from this strategy, from this process. So what is the domain here? If I say what is the domain of, this is very important because in my next video we will solve the domain of inverse trigonometric function. So the domain of sine inverse x will be the range of sine x, right? So what is the range here? -1 to 1. So this range will work as a domain of inverse function. So we'll say the domain is -1 to 1. Okay, the domain is always here. Whenever you see sine inverse x, whenever you see sine inverse x, the domain we will take -1 to 1. Okay, the graph will be something like that. You can see it's just like a cubic function. So whenever you will see, okay, so here and here, I'm not going to write down minus pi by 2 pi by 2. No, we are going to write down from -1 to 1. And here the range here, the range here will be the domain of this one. The range here will be the domain of this one. So this will be what? Minus pi by 2 to pi by 2. So we can say this is what? Pi by 2 and this is what? Minus pi by 2. So this is what the graph of y is equal to sine inverse x, and the domain is -1 to 1. Listen guys, when we talk about sine x, the domain is all real number, and when we have sine inverse x, we will know that the domain is -1 to 1 only. This is the graph, okay, and the range is minus pi by 2 to pi by 2. So I hope guys you all understand about this one, Okay, and I'm going to tell you 3 properties of sine inverse function, because in my next video we will solve the question. Okay, so please have a look on that. Okay, so here the first one, I'm going to explain you about this one. If I just write down sine inverse sine x, right? Sine inverse x sine x, which is always equal to x. But remember here the x belongs to where? Minus pi by 2 to pi by 2y, because here is sine x, right? So here when you put sine x, for example, I put sine pi by 2 here. So this will be what? Sine 90. Whenever sine 90 is 1, then sine inverse 1, sine inverse 1. So sine inverse always has minus 1 to 1. So this condition is true. The first condition is true when x belongs to minus pi by 2 to pi by 2. Next, second property, if you have sine and here you have sine inverse x, okay, then this is also equal to x, but x belongs to, here we want minus 1 to 1, minus 1 to 1. Why? Because if this sine here, if I just write down, for example, sine inverse 1, so this is what? Pi by 2, right? And then sine pi by 2 is what? Sine pi by 2 is always a 1. So when x belongs to what? Minus 1 to 1, we can say sine inverse x can be written as what? X. And the last, third one, okay, this one and this one. Next, which property we have to discuss about? The last one we have sine inverse minus x. If you have sine inverse minus x, this can be written as minus sine inverse x. Okay, so remember, whenever you have sine inverse minus x, this can be written as what? Minus sine inverse x. But again, x belongs to what? Minus. Whenever you have sine inverse, this is what? Minus 1 to 1. So sine inverse minus x can be written as minus sine inverse x. Using these 3 properties here and these 2 concepts here, domain and range, we will solve 5 or 6 questions of trigonometric inverse functions to find the domain. I hope guys you all understand. Again, this is a very complicated topic. Okay, please watch my video 2 times, 3 times, and still you have a problem, you can just mention the comments. Whenever we have a time, we will reply you. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.